fallen heroes of the times. One of the example is the two brothers, Mr. Shah Zaman and Mr. Shah Shuja, the dethroned sovereigns of Kabul and Kashmir. Now I am going to read from a book called The Punjab 100 Years Ago, as described by Mr. V.Jacquemont, 1831, and Mr. A SoltyKoff, 1842. It was translated and edited by H.L.O Garret, IES, Keeper of the Record of Government of Punjab, 1935. And he was also the general editor. On page 13, he writes, "These two dethroned sovereigns are uterine brothers. Shah Zaman the elder is about 60, Shah Shuja 47. The first was a conqueror. He once invaded the Punjab and threatened the English, whose power was then far from being firmly established in the north of India, as it has been since the fall of Holkar." He's basically talking about the invasion of Punjab, which he made two invasions, 1796 and the other in 1798. And the Holkar was the Maratha, whose power was finally crushed at Mahidpur on December the 20th, 1817. Resuming, having occupied Lahore, he was prepared to attack Delhi when a rebellion in his own country caused him to return in haste. Later he was deposed by one of his brothers, who put out his eyes. However, the throne was soon seized by Shah Shuja, who was still a young man and reigning in Kabul when the embassy of Elphinstone visited the country. But then he was on the eve of his ruin. One of his brothers had already taken up arms against him and seized Kabul, and Elphinstone left Peshawar in the midst of the confusion which ensued. Shah Shuja ultimately fell into the hands of Ranjit Singh, who took the opportunity of the troubles of his neighbors to extend his own dominion. Ranjit Singh placed him in close confinement in order to get possession of an enormous diamond, which was famous in the East for its size. They are talking about a famous diamond Koh-Noor, and which I understand Ahmad Shah means Ahmad Shah Durrani, the founder of the Durrani Empire. Ahmad Shah had deposited in the treasury at Kabul. Captain Wade, the political agent, informed the two princes that he wished to bring me to see them and ask them is to fix the convenient time. They fixed the next date. We first visited Shah Zaman with as little ceremony as he was likely to show us, on ponies preceded by one of his officers on a wretched hack. We entered a small courtyard where we dismounted and where were several of the old king's household. One of them better dressed than the others, and who enjoyed some sort of nominal rank, led us into a little garden full of flowers, round which stood some modest little dwellings. We ascended some steps and entered one of them, which was the royal residence. The old gentleman was awaiting us, and we found them squatting at the end of a hall surrounded by his relations. On his right, but at some distance from him, one of his sons was seated on the ground, but he remained perfectly silent during the interview. We stood at Shah's left hand and near him, and he does not speak Hindustani. Wade spoke to him in Persian on my behalf. Considering that he was old, dethroned, and blind, the prince appeared to be in good spirits. We let him do most of the talking. When he learned that I was going into the hills of Kashmir, he expressed his envy and spoke of the delights of Kabul. Since his fall and his blindness, he had made a pilgrimage to Mecca by land. He seems to have been treated with all the considerations on the journey, but he was not exempted from the tax which the Arabs levy on pilgrims. He crossed Persia on an elephant and the desert in a litter carried by 2 camels, a very uncomfortable method of progress. Baghdad is the place which he retains the most pleasant recollection. He received a message from the Sultan offering him a monthly pension of 6,000 rupees and a residence in the city of Asia Minor, an offer the refusal of which he has often since regretted. Despite his misfortunes, he was still attached to his native land. But he did not venture to tell us the absurd hope, but he still cherishes at this time of regaining his throne. Recently he has given up the idea and occupied himself entirely with religious devotion, saying that he has now no more to do with this world but prepared to leave it. He passes the large part of the day in having the Quran read to him and in telling his beads. He is very fond of talking of his pilgrimage to Mecca and says that if he ever had his life over again, he would be a fakir or a pilgrim rather than a king. What is more happy, says he, than the state of a mind without a care, a wanderer by vocation, carrying with him always the idea that a life of such sanctity here will ensure him everlasting happiness in the next world. Since his retirement in Ludhiana, he has often asked permission from the British government to go on pilgrimages, but the places are so indiscreetly chosen that government has suspected him of other intentions and refused permission. The government, it is true, allows a small number of persons who visit him and Shah Shuja to treat them with royal honors, but it would not do at all for the dethroned royalties to be running about India receiving honors which are only allowed to them privately. Shah Zaman's last request was to make a pilgrimage into Gujarat, where one of the Muslim princes of the West had taken up a hostile attitude towards the Hindu neighbors and seemed likely to cross the lower Indus and invade Sindh. It was proved that Shah Zaman was in correspondence with him and they were planning an invasion of Afghanistan. As we desire to take our leave, Wade bid him adieu on my behalf. The old prince replied in suitable terms, and we departed. Shah Zaman is nearly 60, but does not look like it. His complexion is light brown and his features good. His thin beard is dyed and so defies his feature that it may seem to be an artificial one, and this possibly helps to conceal his age. He was very simply dressed, but I noticed that his turban was of great beauty. Despite his age and his devotions, he has not given up women, and he has a small zanana where he passes sometimes daily. I forget to mention that in the course of conversation he complained of impotence, and hearing that I was a doctor, asked for some medicine to restore his vitality. I referred him to Dr. Murray, who has regularly attended him for some years. On certain festivals, the children of the jewelers and the cloth merchants of the city are admitted with their parents' goods into the little garden through which we passed on our way to the old prince. The ladies of the zanana are then permitted to walk about and make purchases at this little market. This is the only diversity which breaks the monotony of their cloistered life. This custom is borrowed from the Persian court, the entire etiquette of which was copied by Ahmad Shah. It also existed at the Mughal court. Shah Shuja, whom we visited next, lived quite near his brother. We were received by one of his officers in a fine garden where the prince is accustomed to receive visitors twice a week at 9 o'clock. But the hour has passed. They told us that he had waited for some time and he at last retired to his harem and would return. We waited for half an hour without his reappearing. Our companion was an elderly man, good-looking and well-dressed. I noticed the beauty of his grey hair, which fell to his shoulders, and I was surprised at this, for the Afghans all shaved their heads. Wade explained to me that these magnificent locks concealed the fact that his ears had been cut off, possibly at Shah Shuja's own order. At last we were told that the prince awaited us in his own apartment. We passed through several gloomy courtyards at the gate, of which the tattered soldiers were lounging on guard, and at last entered a large hall with a gallery round. Shah Shuja was seated on a chair with no other attendants than 4 miserable eunuchs who stood at some distance behind him. We saluted in Indian fashion, but he only returned our salutation with a slight movement of the head and without raising his hand to his forehead. We halted some distance away, but he made us come quite close to his left hand, and we remained standing there during the interview. I was much struck by his appearance. He is a big, powerful man with good and regular features and a dignified and graceful carriage. I had never seen a more distinguished-looking Oriental. He understands Hindustani, so that I several times tried to speak to him without the aid of the interpreter, but his replies, which were always in Persian, had to be translated to me by Wade. He asked me several questions about my travel and seemed to understand their object. I told him I was daily awaiting passports from Ranjit Singh to go to Kashmir, and he seized the opportunity to speak of Ranjit Singh without much regard and of Kashmir with enthusiasm. It was once the richest jewel in his crown, but he did not keep it long. He only saw it during the military expedition that he undertook to reoccupy it and to learn to regret its loss. In his time of prosperity under the Mughals, the revenue of Kashmir was 1 crore of rupees, but Shah Shuja never drew more than 28 lakhs from it. The prince related for my benefit. Wade had heard it so often that he knows it by heart. Some details of his last disastrous expedition to Kashmir. A heavy and unexpected fall of snow barred his entry to the country when he was on its border, and when a numerous section of the population awaited him as a liberator. His small force was almost entirely composed of Indians from the plains, who were so overcome and so benumbed by the severe cold in the mountains that he could not get them to advance, and he had to retreat, or rather flee, with no other escort than a few faithful servants. He then crossed the mountains of Kallu and travelled 3 days in the snow before arriving on the banks of the Satluj opposite the Kotkar. He remarked that Kashmir could easily be conquered by a small body of troops disciplined in European fashion, and that hardly more would be wanted for the conquest of Afghanistan. Elphinstone's escort, according to him, would have been sufficient to decide the war, the issue of which proved so fatal to Shah Shuja. The little Afghan armies are not only the most undisciplined, but the most treacherous in the world. The most popular of the leaders would suddenly find himself deserted on the field of battle. Disloyalty among these people appears a mere whim rather than a deliberate treachery. It is not only the crown of Afghanistan that Shah Shuja appears to regret, it is the country itself, his native land. He spoke with rapture of the mountains of Kabul, of their forests and pastures, their limpid and icy torrents, of the varied pleasures that each season of the year begins, of the hunting in the snow in winter, of flowers and brilliance of spring, of the fruits of summer and autumn. The object of my journey showed him that I was a doctor, and he made almost the same confession to me that his brother has done, though in more indiscreet language. In his case, he complained of stomach weakness. I put several questions to him regarding the health, and his answers confirmed my impression of his perfect fitness. I told him that lack of appetite of which he complained was undoubtedly due to want of exercise, and told him to take more of the latter and eat less, adding that moderation was the best remedy for most complaints and the best way of restoring functions ruined by overindulgence. Further, that from Dr. Murray he would get the best advice as to her health. He was very surprised at my spectacles and still more at my reason for wearing them, for he had no idea of short sight. Have not the European doctors discovered a remedy for lengthening or shortening the sight? Are not the spectacles an admirable remedy? I replied, and he appeared struck by the justice of my remark. He dislikes Ludhiana. The monotony of the plains and the great heat of the summer affected one used to the mountains and made him regret his own country. Wade remarked that he has often advised him to spend the summer in Simla and assured him that the government would agree to such a proposal, but the prince dropped the idea. Our visit has been a long one. I put an end to it by expressing to the prince my hope that he would regain the throne of Kabul, persuaded that I should then be allowed to visit in safely that country, still almost unknown in Europe. Shah Shuja suitably replied, and we took our leave. No one could appear more royal than this dethroned monarch, dignified without stiffness and noble without affection. His costume was exquisite without being magnificent. On his head was a pale green turban of Kashmir tissue of the most delicate pattern. He wore a dressing gown with white sleeves of the same material as his turban, but perfectly white and covered with palm leaves, half the size of one hand. This robe was secured on his breast by a large clasp of precious stone in the form of a palm. He carried a plain dagger in his girdle, a long bamboo cane with the handle of a royal crystal trousers of red silk, and stockings of variegated cashmere, and green slippers like those of his household. The room in which he received us was open to the sky in the middle, and in the center a small fountain played in the basin. This hall was merely a large gallery round a small square court. It was without decoration, and walls seemed never to have been cleaned. The officer who introduced us, the one without his ears, remained standing in front of the prince some paces away all through the interview. At Shah Zaman's, the same procedure had been observed. Both officials wore scarlet socks. It is the etiquette in Persian only to appear before the Shah in scarlet socks. All the servants of the two former kings of Kabul who are in attendance on their master invariably wear these ceremonial stockings. The large number of their old servants who have followed and rejoined them at Ludhiana is ruining these two princes. But they have the satisfaction of being able to live among these evidences of their vanished glory, and as they supply them with food, to be equally respected as is in the past. These men also form a nucleus of partisans who are all ready to hand to accompany them and assist in the enterprise against Kabul, of which they are forever dreaming. Despite the extremely modest amount of pensions which they personally pay, an economy of their own domestic expenses, Shah Zaman is always in debt, while Shah Shuja, who keeps a larger, though equally shabby retinue, only meets his expenditure by periodically selling some of his jewelry. He, as it appears, retains some stones of great value. Indeed, it is the high price which renders their sale difficult, for few people in India can afford to pay the price demanded for his diamonds. In the earlier years of his stay in Ludhiana, Shah Shuja took a great interest in drilling his troops. He was constantly to be seen out of doors, nearly always on a horse, sometimes on an elephant, and showed an energy rare among the Asiatics. When the heat of the summer drove him indoors, he complained of the inactivity enforced upon him. Wade then advised him to write his memoirs, and this occupied him one whole summer. Wade, who had read them, says the memoirs are written with remarkable purity and elegance, as Shah Shuja is a well-read prince. For the last 2 years he has abandoned his active habits. Wade notices a general depression of his spirits, and although he continues to speak of his hope of once more regaining the throne of Kabul, it seems probable that he lacks the necessary energy for a further attempt. Yet he is well aware how easy the conquest of Afghanistan would be to any enterprising leader, and how it would be particularly so in his own case, as his first reign had been unusually popular. But he has lost confidence in his strength. Wade has translated for him his use a number of passages from Elphinstone's book, which he is very fond of discussing, though he certainly blames Elphinstone for letting him lose his throne by refusing to take part in the military operations which brought about his downfall. The English envoy expressed his appreciation of the prince's consideration and courtesy, and it is no doubt for this reason that the government treats him more liberally than his brother, who has no special claim upon their generosity. When the brothers meet, they do so on terms of perfect equality, though in public Shah Shuja's claims precedence over Shah Zaman. He wishes to make the latter his pensioner and to receive from government the 6,000 paid to him jointly each month in order that Shah Zaman may receive his share from his brother's hand. But his demand has been flatly refused. He has often expressed a wish to be received by the Governor-General, but difficulties on points of etiquette made Lord Amherst refuse the request, and Lord William Bentinck is also averse to the proposal. When Shah Shuja has been demanding for a number of years is that he should receive back his residence and pension in the event of his leaving India, making a last attempt on Kabul and returning unsuccessful and penniless fugitive. To this the government has always replied that he was at liberty to quit their territory and to take part in any expedition outside that he chose, but he has always refrained from telling him how he would be treated if he came back again. No government in Europe is more equitable in its political policy. The Afghans who have followed their former rulers live apart from the rest of the population of Ludhiana. I am referring this to those of high rank. This rank they maintained in their exile and only marry among themselves. These Durrani Sardars, who now live on pensions of rupees 15 to 20 a month, would consider few Mussulmans in India of sufficient nobility to marry their daughters or to give them theirs in marriage. As to the two princes, they would only ally themselves with the imperial house of Delhi, to which they are already related. Ahmad Shah, having married one of the princes of the house of Taimur, when he took Delhi after the Battle of Panipat in 1761. Their zananas are full of children. Dr. Murray has been called in several times at the last moment to visit princesses. They are treated like slaves by the eunuchs who guard them. Murray had to attend a case of fistula in one of the wives of Shah Zaman, but he only saw the patient through a hole in a sheet of silk. But the young woman broke the rules and braved the threats and blows of the eunuchs to see the European doctor, whom they regarded with great curiosity. All the Afghans are Sunnis, which is also the sect of descendants of Taimur, while the king of Oudh is descended from the Persian Shia family. When Commander-in-Chief Lord Combermere came to Ludhiana, Wade had a difficult point of etiquette to solve. The general wished to see Shah Shuja, and the latter was equally anxious to see the hero of Bharatpur. What was doubtful was that if the king would offer the general a seat on level with his own, or if the general consented to pay the first visit, it would be insisted that his honor should be accorded to him. Wade arranged that they should meet at a review, so that they were able to converse without the question of their rank rising. Further, Shah Shuja, who is an excellent horseman, preferred to appear in a saddle rather than on his tinsel throne. This description basically has the effect of describing not only the plight of the fallen monarchs of Kabul, but also a little bit about the politics of the times. And it is for this reason that I have read this passage from this book. I hope you have enjoyed this, and I would be putting such passages about various things from the travelers who have traveled throughout the world in difficult lands, because in my view, the best way to rediscover history is to read from the travelers of that time rather than from the textbooks, which sometimes have agendas of their own. It's not that the travelers don't have prejudices. It's not that they don't have they can be selective in their observation. But generally, for a time period in history and a place, if you have got the description of 2-3 travelers which came at different times and preferably from different backgrounds and ethnicity, one can develop a much better appreciation of history. With this, I would like to end this conversation, and I hope that you have enjoyed it. Thank you very much.